There are certain universal principles that all of our wisdom streams are built upon. And today I want to talk about two of those systems, if you will. The first is alchemy. And at its core, alchemy is about transmutation. It's about taking what alchemists called the prima materia, or massa confusa, this confused mass that's within us, and transforming it into gold, transforming it into something valuable. Then we've got the gene keys. And at the core, its message is every shadow contains a gift. And I hope that you can see how those two are so similar. And so the question is, if every shadow contains a gift, how then do we germinate the seed of that shadow? There's a Trinity that's talked about in the gene keys system: seed, flower, fruit. And the seed is the shadow frequency. But within that shadow frequency, with the right water and sunlight and attention, we can grow that seed into the flower, which represents the gift. And then ultimately, that flower turns into the fruit or the harvest that we pull in, and that is what is the city. So the question is how to take that seed and turn it into the fruit, or as the alchemists would see it, how to take that base material, that negredo, and turn it into rubedo, or gold light. And shadows are, at their core, initiations. We used to have lots of different ancient rituals. For example, a walkabout that the Aboriginal people in Australia went on as boys transitioned to men. Or there's a tribe in the Pacific that makes a bungee rope out of a bunch of vines, and they build this big platform, and the members of the tribe have to make a leap of faith off of this platform before they're welcomed back. In our times, we are lacking eldership. We are lacking an organization to give us initiation so that we can be welcomed back into the tribe and be of service. However, our soul knows that initiation is required. And so it brings these shadows to us so that we can fight what a man named Francis Weller, which is where a lot of the teachings that I'm going to do today are coming from. He's got an amazing series called The Alchemy of Initiation. He has dubbed this archetype within us the predator. And the predator is a part of self that is designed to bring us through initiatory experiences, to bring us to the threshold of us being torn apart. And it's in that period that our soul can come into alignment. It's in that period where we are brought right to our edge, to the point that we are required to surrender. We just cannot do it anymore. And in that moment of letting go, in that moment of going into death, then and only then do we become free. And can we go back to the tribe in service, because we're no longer worried about ourselves. So this is intimately tied, as I said, to transmutation. And I just quickly want to talk about this word because the meaning of it has changed over time. So it used to be taking base metals like lead and turning it into gold. This was the only definition of transmutation, so intimately tied to alchemy. Then it was taking one element and transforming it into some other element. We'll call this element A and this element B. And that was with like radioactive decay or nuclear bombardment. So as our science developed, we realized, oh man, we really can change one element into another element. And there's a teaching in the Hermetic principles, as above, so below. So if this is true, and we know that it is true at this point, it must also be true internal to ourselves. The thing is though, alchemy was never about transforming lead into gold. The reason that they used the language and the imagery that they did is that this was popular at a time where the church was running rampant and killing a lot of people that disagreed with what they believed. So the alchemists had to get creative. They had to use language about personal and, more importantly, spiritual development that didn't get the church upset. And that is why they use this symbolism, because of course the church was like, yeah, get us more gold. We would love that. So the thing with alchemy is you've got to get the joke. You can't take it literally. So the first part of alchemy that's really important to understand is we must offer the shadow a container. And the word that was used at the time was a crucible. So we must create this vessel that lives within us. And if you Google like alchemy art, you'll see pictures of like some scientist looking guys, and always front and center is typically a big glass vessel. And there's some heat underneath it. And there's all sorts of like tubes and smoke, and typically there's wisdom, so there's books, places. And the core of alchemy is this container. There's a quote from a guy named Albertus Magnus. And what he said is that if God had not given us a vessel, his other gifts would have been of no avail. We need a container, and it needs to be strong. We need something strong enough to be able to hold, separate, and warm the material that is contained within the crucible. And keeping it warm, or using heat, is the second core practice of alchemy. So we've got a container and we've got heat. The alchemist was known as an artist in fire. The symbolism here is that intense emotions require a container. Otherwise, we become overwhelmed. We blend in with that emotion and we can do nothing with it. So what we must do is build our vessel. And in order to do that, we need a few things. First, we need time and patience. Glass breaks if it's not tempered, right? If it gets too hot too soon, think about taking something out of the fridge and putting it in the microwave, or putting it on something hot, right? That glass just shatters. So we need to make sure we slowly introduce heat. We need to take our time with things, let it roll around. It takes deliberateness and repetition. In other words, conscious awareness and coming back to this vessel and the material contained within it over and over again. It needs to be big enough or capable of holding our whole experience. Sometimes it can be a lot to be a human and to hold all of the things that are happening. And then finally, as you're building your vessel, it needs to separate as well as contain the material within it. You cannot develop a soulful life without these things, especially without containment. You have to be able to notice what's happening inside of you. You have to be able to attend to it, reflect on it, and witness it. And if it overtakes you, you cannot see it because you become it. So we need this vessel to hold it so that we can witness, so that we can view, so that we have some separateness, so that we understand that there's something that we are working with. Now the next step after the vessel, as I said, is about the heat. So we must maintain the heat. There's a writer named Hillman, and he had this quote, "You get from a fire only what the fire is fed. You get from fire only what the fire is fed." So if you think about building a campfire, the way that we get a giant campfire is by putting lots of effort and wood into the pile. Whereas if we feed that fire rocks, it's not going to matter how many rocks we put in there. So the way that we feed the fire is with attention, with awareness. It's with affection, self-love, forgiveness, care. It's with interest. It's so easy to be distracted by our phones, by food, by sex, by shopping, you name it. You need effort in order to maintain the heat. And that typically comes in the form of practices that you can do. So this might be meditation, maybe breath work, etc. By giving time and attention to our fire, we're able to choose how hot we want to make it. And if you do not keep the material contained within your crucible, within your vessel warm, it starts to harden and turn cold. How many of you know what I'm talking about there? Something happens to us, a big or little t trauma, and we do not give it attention then because we do not have the tools perhaps, or we don't think we can hold it, and it begins to congeal, it begins to harden, it begins to freeze inside of us, and it leads to these stuck patterns. So the question that you have to ask yourself as you engage in this work is, what are you willing to pay attention to every day? Because without it staying warm, there is no movement. It gets hard. It shuts down. There's no flow. Next, we must keep the vessel clear. So remember, I said these are glass vessels. The vessel cannot be vague or cloudy because we must see things as they are. In other words, we cannot look through our conditioning. We have to be able to see clearly what is happening. So that means no defenses and no masks, no pretending like you are something else. We also must make the vessel strong. So as I mentioned before, if we apply too much heat too fast, the vessel can break. Well, also, if we apply too much pressure, too much tension, too much tightness too soon, again, the vessel will break. So to look at our wounds and our suffering and to transmute them takes a ton of energy. Think about the times that you've gone into the darkness and think about how much it takes out of you, how hard it can be to engage in the outside world when we do that. And because it takes so much energy, we need a vessel that can handle all of that pressure, all of that energy. Pressure is just energy trying to expand out. There's more energy inside the vessel than there is outside the vessel, and it seeks equilibrium. And there are a few ways that we can control the pressure to make sure that our crucible doesn't break. First, we need discipline. Again, we need to do this daily. We need to come back to our practices. We need to know when we need to take a break. You know, there's also the other side of this is solely being focused on it all the time because you can't let go. That's another form of pressure and requires discipline. Also, passion is another thing that's required to control the pressure and the heat. Too much heat, too much pressure, and the material turns to ash. So too much heat, and we end up with ash. Not enough heat, and the material hardens. And so we need the right amount of discipline and the right amount of passion to make sure that the material in the vessel and the vessel are able to do the work that they are supposed to do together. So some questions that you can ask yourself about your vessel. Can you take the heat? Are you cloudy or dense? Are you slow to warm? Are you leaky? Are you fragile? Are you full to overflowing? Are you empty or are you cracked? Can you take the heat? Are you cloudy or dense? Are you slow to warm? Are you leaky? Are you fragile? Are you full to overflowing? Are you empty or are you cracked? Those are all great questions to ask yourself about your vessel. Next is we need the mouth of the vessel. So the top part where things enter and exit must be effectively sealed. In other words, we need a form of restraint. We need to be able to keep things inside of us until they are done cooking. The way that this shows up most often is sharing too soon, and I am certainly guilty of this. I actually have the word restraint on a sticky note on my computer right this moment. It is our job as humans trying to be of service and help other humans not to dump out everything that we have in our hearts and in our minds, but to use restraint so that we can meet people where they are and help them take their next steps. So sometimes without restraint, we lose energy because we're not able to hold something. We need to hold these things inside of us sometimes so that they can ripen. Remember, seed, flower, fruit, we've got to give it a chance to reach maturity. And so often we just want to run and speak our truth, but it's not ready yet. And because it's not ready yet, the recipe can be spoiled. If you break the seal too soon, the recipe can be spoiled. Also, your soul is shy. Your soul has an intimate and divine connection to you. And because of that, it is giving things to you sometimes that are for you and you alone. And if we bring them out into the world, your soul can just kind of be like, what the heck? That wasn't supposed to go anywhere. That was for you. And then the last thing I want to talk about is sometimes we share because we can't hold the charge. We can't hold it. And because of that, we just let it fly out. We think it's too difficult. This needs to get out of me. I've got to take it out on somebody else, or I've got to take it out on myself. And then we break that seal. So, how do we begin to build this adequate container inside of ourselves? First is with your imagination, which, if you haven't heard my spiel on that before, imagination and intuition are very, very similar. So we use our imagination to begin to see that vessel inside of ourselves. Try and see what it looks like. You can even draw it or sketch it, or you can write a paragraph describing it. And then I want you to feel what's inside of it. See what color it is. Is it bubbling? Is it slimy? But just try and picture that material. And then observe those inner movements very closely. Observe what's happening in that vessel. Whether it's moving around or whether it's still, whether it's cloudy. Then we must engage in those practices that I talked about earlier. Those practices in self-regulation, those practices in connecting with the divine, those are things that help us to build an adequate container. Something that's really important to understand here is that what's going on inside of the vessel is not for you. So often we think, I need to go through this transformation so that I can become the person that I need to be in the world so that I can show up in service. That's a whole lot of eyes. And the material could care less about the egoic you. Instead, it is about the material. This material has a purpose. It has something to share with the world. So your role as an alchemist isn't to become a better alchemist. That's not what this is about. It's to help the material become what it is meant to become. The material is in charge here. The material is going through a transition and a transmutation. It's your job to help guide that material along. Help it to come to maturity, to reach that fruit. But so often we confuse it with, I am improving myself as an alchemist. The feeling inside of you wants something. That darkness, that shadow, it's calling to you. It wants to transform into something. And your job is to find out what it is. By looking within, by working with it, by keeping the heat right, by applying the right amount of pressure. I'm gonna leave you with one more idea today, and then we'll do a part 2 on this as well. And it's the idea of separatio. I think I spelled that right. So separatio, or separating. So what you're working with must be defined. The material contained within the crucible must be defined. Carl Jung has a quote that I absolutely love. You cannot heal what you cannot separate from. You cannot heal what you cannot separate from. That's why we need to define the material. We need to be able to see it. If there is a part of you that acts out, you cannot work with that part until you have named it and seen it for what it is. Otherwise, you think you are that part. And if you're not familiar with parts work, give IFS, or Internal Family Systems, a Google. The founder's name is Dick Schwartz. And the idea is that we have all these different parts of self inside of us. And until we are able to see all of those parts of self and name them and not cast them out, right? It's not to name them so that we can, create a divide or a separateness. It's to see them and name them so that ultimately we can welcome them in to who and what we are. Until I can see it, until it's defined, I am powerless. I lose all control. In non-dual meditation, they talk about the idea of the witness consciousness or the observer consciousness. So we have a thought, feeling, or emotion, and there's this thing that happens where there's the thought, feeling, or emotion, and then there's somebody or something that is noticing the thought, feeling, or emotion. And if you go to the words that are, that voice that's in your head all of the time, you'll catch this. You'll be like, oh, I'm feeling this. And if that's the thought going through your mind and you say, I'm feeling this, then there must be an I that is feeling this, right? It takes time. And once you feel that or see it, it changes everything. So the key is to live in the present moment. Because when a part takes over, we are operating from a past trauma more times than not. We are operating like we are the 7, 10, or 16-year-old version of ourself. Because we're responding from habit. We're responding to, okay, this thing happened in the past. I know that this is how I need to act in order to safely come out on the other side. So that's what I'm going to do. So we need to be able to learn how to catch that pattern and separate from it so that we can stay in the present moment. And it's what keeps us in relationship with both ourselves and the world. Because it allows me to see the pain that is inside of me. And it makes me know that I am not that pain, right? That there is a difference. There's the pain and then there is me. And that gives me a sense that there is a bottom. In other words, that this isn't going to go on forever. That there is a finite amount of this material. And because I'm able to see this pain in myself, I'm able to know that that same pain is in everyone else around me. And then it connects me and makes me compassionate and caring. And it helps me to know and see the pain in other people. So that feels like enough for today. As I said, there's going to be a part 2 here where we go deeper into the prima materia, the massa confusa, some of the transformative states like nigredo and rubedo. I think that it will really be helpful for you to be willing to work with this darkness. We're so obsessed with the light as a culture, especially as a spiritual subculture. And that obsession with the light is negating half or more of our experience. And so we've got to change the narrative around the nigredo, around the darkness, around the shadow. Because ultimately that is the same energy that we press into service of the world. So this was a teaching that I did for the people that I work with in a small group container, and they were kind enough to say, yes, share it, put it out there. It was helpful for us, and we bet it'll be helpful for them. Thank you to my Synarchy for saying to go ahead and do this. I'd love to connect with you also in our free container. I call them wisdom calls, We do them every other Thursday. The next one is October the 24th at noon. That's Eastern time in the United States. The link to sign up will be in the description, and I hope to see you there. Thanks, guys.